Good morning, everyone, and welcome to NYU's Global Journeys, this time to Washington, DC. My name is Marianne Petit. I'm with the Office of Global Programs in New York, and it is my pleasure to introduce today Michael Erwick, the director of NYU Washington. Michael began his role at NYU Washington fall 2012 when the site first opened for its first cohort of students, and he also teaches experiential learning courses for first-year students enrolled there. Before joining NYU, Michael received his PhD in molecular genetics from Washington University in St. Louis and worked for over 11 years at the University of Maryland, directing study abroad and teaching short-term courses for pre-medical students in London, Paris, Amsterdam, Madrid, and Cape Town. Additionally, Michael is the board chair for Jan's Tutoring House, a Washington-based nonprofit organization that specializes in providing educational activities for children in need. And so now it is my pleasure to hand the program over to Michael.
Thank you, Marianne, and welcome students. It's good to have you with us this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. Matthew Santirocco is faculty director of NYU DC, is also professor of classics, and Angelo J. Ranieri, director of ancient studies at NYU. He was for many years dean of the College of Arts and Science, and then until 2017, Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs with university-wide responsibility for undergraduate education, global curriculum, and instructional technology. Before arriving at NYU, he was College Dean at the University of Pennsylvania and had also taught at Pittsburgh, Columbia, Emory, and Brown. A graduate of Columbia and Cambridge, Matthew studies and teaches Greek and Roman literature and thought. He recently guest edited a special issue of the journal Daedalus on new approaches to the ancient world. He also edits the Palgrave monograph series, The New Antiquity, and is currently writing a book about poetry, patronage, and politics in Augustan Rome. To promote the interdisciplinary cross-cultural study of the past, he founded and directs NYU Center for Ancient Studies. In addition to his scholarly work, Matthew has also promoted educational innovation. He was a founding member of the board of the Reinvention Center, now Reinvention Collaborative, a national consortium committed to improving undergraduate education at research universities. At Penn, he developed humanities curriculum for the MBA and executive education programs at the Wharton School, with which he also partnered to create an undergraduate program in international studies and business, which was joint with the Liberal Arts College. Finally, at NYU, he spearheaded the effort to create our academic center in Washington, DC. He also led faculty in the development of a new core curriculum, an undergraduate research program, first-year seminars, and perhaps most importantly, the initial academic program for NYU Shanghai. The recipient of numerous grants and awards, Matthew was elected a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2009, and since 2011 has served as the Academy's Assistant Secretary for the Humanities and Social Sciences. He is currently president-elect of the Society for Classical Studies. Ron Christie is founder and CEO of Christie Strategies, LLC, a full-service communications and issue management firm in Washington, D.C. Christie is also the author of 3 books. His most recent title, Blackwards, How Black Leadership is Returning America to the Days of Separate but Equal, was published in September 2012. Christie serves as a lecturer at New York University's Washington, D.C. campus. He also serves as an adjunct professor at the McCourt Graduate School of Public Policy and the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He is a member of the Advisory Council of the John Bradama Center at New York University. Mr. Christie, a veteran senior advisor of both the White House and the Congress, brings years of government relations experience. From 2002 to 2004, he was acting director of the USA Freedom Corps and special assistant to President George W. Bush. He began service at the White House in 2001 as deputy assistant to Vice President Cheney for domestic policy, advising the vice presidents on policy initiatives in healthcare, budget, tax, and other policy areas. As a frequent commentator on current political events, Christie serves as a political analyst for BBC World in North America. He first appeared on their global 2012 election night coverage and reprised this role to cover the 2014 midterm election cycle, as well as the 2016 and 2020 presidential cycle. On January 8, 2019, BBC 4 Radio debuted Christie's first documentary, The Trump Republicans, a look at the first 2 years of the Trump administration. BBC World Service aired the documentary on February 13, 2019. A native of Palo Alto, California, he received his BA from Haverford College and his JD from George Washington University National Law Center. And with that, I'm pleased to turn it over to Matthew and Ron.
Michael, thank you. Ron, it's great to see you here today after that incredible introduction from Michael. I can hardly wait to hear what we have to say. But I've got to start by talking, maybe asking you a little bit, not so much about Washington, DC, our center, but to start out by speaking a little bit about the current political landscape. Because, we listen to your podcast, we see you on television all the time, but this is a very different, very private, intimate setting. And I'm with a few students and colleagues from the university, from our different sites around the world. I wonder if you could just give us, a private, your insider view of what you think is really going on in Washington right now. I mean, so much has changed since January 6th, and I'm curious about what you're making of the current American political landscape.
Good morning, Matthew. And Michael, thank you very much for that very gracious and too long introduction, but I'll take what I can get. I would say to you, Matthew, that we are in unprecedented times here in Washington, DC. I've been here for almost 30 years now, and I've never seen or felt the climate the way that it is. I think January 6th is the inflection point for a lot of the uncertainty that we have here in Washington right now. The certification of the Electoral College, in other words, the certification of Joe Biden as the next president of the United States, brought thousands upon thousands of people to Washington. And we've all seen the video. We've all seen the results of those who stormed the Capitol. But it transformed that institution in a way also that I've never seen before. There are a lot of members of Congress who are fearful to go to work. One of my students at Georgetown is a member of the National Guard and was deployed for a month inside the Capitol. And he told a story of members and staff who would scurry to their offices or go to the chamber to vote, but didn't want to interact with anyone else. And that dynamic has played out now that we have a 50-50 power sharing agreement in the United States Senate. And for those of you who don't know, our Constitution provides that the Vice President of the United States, who is also the President of the United States Senate, Kamala Harris, is in a position, if there's a 50-50 tie, that she can cast the tie-breaking, not tie-making, but the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. And so now you have a very narrowly comprised majority in the House of Representatives. You have a very narrowly comprised majority in the United States Senate. And so with a new president and a new administration, there's still a sense of wariness of what's to come. And from my perspective, the people that I speak to on either end of Pennsylvania Avenue, one end Capitol Hill, the other end 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, otherwise known as the White House, there's a little trepidation of what still might be coming and whether or not we can sort of calm the very, very fractious political atmosphere here in Washington, D.C.
It's interesting, you talk about the fractious political atmosphere. What are some of the issues? Again, focusing still, I want to ask a little bit about international relations shortly, but focusing just on what's going on in American politics. What are the issues, the big issues that you see we're going to have to be facing in the next 4 years? If we have students there, they will be witnessing this history unfolding. What are the issues that you see we're going to have to tackle, and that this unusual situation complicates perhaps, or maybe offers opportunities?
Well, let's do it this way. Let's look at our northern border. Let's go down south to our southern border, and then let's talk about what's going on in the United States. One of the things that we've had a problem about in America for the last several decades is having a coherent energy policy. And the president and the Congress have been unable to work in a bipartisan fashion to craft and sign legislation into law to address our energy needs. And so what you've seen is President Trump and his administration signed via an executive order the construction of the Keystone Pipeline that will allow oil to be imported from Canada into the United States and into the interior of the country. And a president is able to execute an executive order with a signature of his or her pen. And immediately thereafter, we worked with Canada to start importing this oil. One of the initial decisions via executive order that President Biden did was repeal what his predecessor in office had done. And this caused a great deal of uncertainty amongst Republicans, amongst Democrats of, wait a second, if we're doing this to preserve the environment, you're now still going to have the oil coming from the tar fields of Alberta into the United States, but now they're going to be coming in via rail and via truck? Is that really the safest move for the environment? So there's a lot of back and forth going on, Matthew, as it relates to energy in the United States. Then we go to our southern border. And once again, via executive order, President Trump signed a document that allowed construction of a wall on the southern border of the United States in an attempt to stem immigration coming from Central America and coming from Mexico. Early in his days in the White House, President Biden signed an executive order that repealed much of what President Trump had sought to do. And now you see thousands of people migrating from the South headed towards the northern border in the United States. And once again, we find ourselves in a situation of what do we do with thousands of young children, often unaccompanied without their parents, who are now here? How do we address that? What do we do with that? And on a broader domestic issue, we just signed a $1.9 trillion bill ostensibly dealing with COVID relief. Republicans will tell you only $350 billion of that immediately goes out the door for COVID relief. Democrats will say it didn't go far enough. And in fact, we had an proposed increase to the minimum wage to $15. And how do we find a way to get wages here in the States to rise and to have a more equitable playing field? And so when you look at energy, when you look at immigration, when you look at the workforce, those are three of the top issues that we're looking at. And we haven't even touched on transportation, infrastructure, bridges, to say nothing of the international issues that I know that we're going to touch on.
That's so interesting, Ron. Well, you mentioned the international issues. Maybe we can go to that for a little bit because you talked about the northern border and the southern border. But moving farther afield, it's very interesting that our New York University students who choose to come to DC or to any of our sites, they're coming themselves from countries around the globe. And so many of them look at Washington, DC, not only as the American capital, but as a great international city, which it is as well. And I just wonder if you could reflect a little bit about how the international geopolitical landscape has changed, again, in the last few years, and if you feel comfortable prognosticating where it's going, because students who are visiting with us and studying with us will be watching it from that Washington vantage point. So talk a little bit about that, the international scene.
It's a fascinating scene, Matthew. It's so interesting for me, for being here as long as I have, that the ambassadors to the different countries from around the world really have their own subtle influence in what's going on in United States public policy formulation, as well as international politics. And the DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission, who just departed from the Embassy of Switzerland, had been here for the last 5 years, and we got to be very good friends. And it was interesting for me to sit down with him and to listen to him talk about the United States and talk about the world from the prism and perspective of a diplomat from a neutral country. And how do the Swiss see the world? And so this was, of course, during the Trump administration. And they looked at this and they thought, well, gosh, why did America pull out of the Paris Climate Accords? What is America doing moving its embassy from one city in Israel to a contested site in Israel? What is going on with the United States and her European allies as it relates to Iran? Are we isolating Iran for the good of the world, or are we making a very difficult spot in the Middle East even more of a tinderbox for future military and geostrategic conflict? And so I loved looking at that from his eyes because it helped open my eyes to the way that the rest of the world sees us. Washington can be a very insular city, but there's so many people, so many diplomats from every country around the world who look to us for wisdom and leadership, but also have to go back to their home country and explain to their leadership how they should interact with us. And so what we've seen in the last 2 months with the change of administration here in the States is I think that many of the diplomatic corps are trying to recalibrate their relationships with the United States. And it's a very interesting time to observe the American political scene, not from the perspective of being an American who is a practitioner, but for me, for being a political analyst, as you mentioned, or Michael mentioned, of trying to explain American politics to the world and frame that to the people around the world internationally who are looking at us.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And you do have that dual perspective, which you bring to your classroom as well, as somebody who's an insider, who's been in government and in politics, but are also a scholar and an analyst, and you can look at it from different points of view. I was struck when you mentioned Switzerland as a neutral country and how they look at the lay of the land as it currently exists. Could you say something about other relationships that we might have? For example, let's say China, which is an increasingly important relationship for the United States and for other countries. What do you see happening there?
Well, I think that we're in a very tense relationship right now with China. I think from a geostrategic perspective, the United States and China need each other. These are two of the strongest economies in the world. These are two of the stronger military presences in the world. But as the United States looks at the South Asian region of the world, we have a lot of issues that have yet to be resolved. We have been looking at, for example, the relationship between the United States and Taiwan, the United States and China, and how do we forge a path moving forward that doesn't lead to military conflict. We look at the United States and China and what happens with the virus that has afflicted all of the world. And we need to find a way forward to ensure that we can get out of this pandemic and work together collaboratively, rather than waving fingers of blame and accusation, which are never good in the short term from a diplomatic perspective. But we also need to look at how the United States, how China can look to other regions of the world. And the region that I look and have my eye on is the African continent. And China has had a very strong presence in Africa for the last several decades, as has the United States, obviously. And I have found it fascinating back in the days of when I used to represent the prime minister of a country in Africa, of how much of the infrastructure, the schools, had been funded by the Chinese government, and how China is looking to expand its reach, not just in the Asian continent, not just with her European allies, but in the African continent, that I've found to be fascinating to watch for the last 20 years.
That's really interesting. When I hear you're talking about this, you talk of challenges, but I hear also opportunities.
I do.
This is an interesting moment. You want to say something about that? Because if students are studying in Washington, they'll be witnessing not only are dealing with challenges, but trying to take things to a new and a different and a more positive level. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think with our last couple of presidents, we have had a fractious relationship with President Xi. I think given the 8 years of the vice presidency, almost 30 years in the United States Senate, and now serving as president of the United States, Joe Biden, also in his time, of course, as being chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has a very strong grasp of the challenges that confront us, but also the opportunities moving forward. And I say this as a Republican and a conservative. And I am hopeful that he will use his relationships, particularly those forged at the highest levels with the Chinese government, to find a constructive way forward on trade, on military issues, and to also expand our cultural opportunities. And something I know that we care a great deal about here at NYU, of it's always more difficult to find fault with someone that you know, and someone that you understand, and someone that you've had the opportunity to break bread with. And that's why I think cultural opportunities such as the ones that we offer allow people to get to know each other, not as members of this country as that, but as individuals and of people.
It's interesting, very, very powerful. I want to shift a little bit in our conversation. We've been talking a lot about American and international politics. Let's focus a little more on NYU Washington, DC. And I'm just curious for your own personal perspective about why you think a student might want to spend a semester studying at our center in Washington. It's obvious, I guess, if was a student of politics or public policy or international relations, journalism. We're right next door to the Associated Press building. I mean, some of that's sort of obvious. But what if you're a student who's majoring in something else? I mean, I'm, for example, the faculty director, but as you heard, I'm a classicist, right? I'm a humanist. We have lots of students who are interested in business who come to study with us, or economics. Could you say a little bit about, with your experience, why it makes sense for those students to come and study in Washington, DC, and particularly at this time as you describe it?
Well, let me go back and say that when you look at the international prism, the focal point that we have here in Washington, DC, one of the things that I loved when I was an intern, when I was in college, was availing myself of the embassies. the embassies open their doors and they have free concerts. You're talking, is it classical music? Is it art? Is it food? Is it a cooking demonstration? And did I mention they're free? And there's nothing better than being a student with no money than being able to go to the different embassies and go to the different museums and to avail yourself of the cultural Washington, DC, and meet so many people who are like you. And everybody's young, everybody's poor, but everyone is a sponge and they are trying to get as much as they can out of the experience and wring it out and then go back to college energized and hopefully with a little bit more money in their pocket. But with this political climate, Matthew, I look at my students here at NYU who most of them are interested in politics, but I have several who are interested in business, and same at Georgetown University. And I teach a course called The Business of Lobbying. And it's the skill set that you learn here is looking at very complex issues, being able to distill those issues down, and then chart a path forward of, okay, I've identified, we were talking about this in class last night. What are the complexities involved? What are the potential alternatives? What are the adversaries to your position going to say? And how do you overcome those adversarial positions to achieve your desired outcome? And that's what this town is all about. And it doesn't matter whether you're a nursing student, doesn't matter whether you're an art student or a business student, is that I think that our facility and our faculty here, as small as this center might be, is a gold mine of opportunity to connect different students from different backgrounds to have one common experience, which is being here, particularly at this time with the still peaceful transformation of one presidency to the next.
That's so interesting because in answering the question, you went beyond specific subject matter, right? Because one can study business, one can study many of these subjects at Washington, DC, or any of our, or many of our global sites. But what one learns is something that goes beyond the individual courses. One of the things I think about a lot is leadership. And we have in Washington, DC, as I believe one of the slides that we showed earlier talked about, a leadership program. But whether one's in that program or not, one of the things that students learn when they are here, because they're interacting in the way that you suggest with other folk in the city and with one another, are leadership skills. I think it's kind of interesting that in the year, I think it was 2020, that all three of the Schwartzman scholars that were chosen from NYU Shanghai happened to have spent a semester at NYU DC. I don't know whether that's a coincidence or not, but it's rather nice because that program is, again, designed to train global leaders. And that's something that I guess, regardless of your specific subject area, Washington, DC can provide as an experience. What sort of, I'm just curious, with your own students, what sort of internships? You've talked about the informal use of the city, the embassies, the culture, and so forth. What sort of concrete experiential education have they received? Because one of the hallmarks of the site is not just courses, but going out into the community for enrichment, but also for professional learning. Can you say a little bit about that from your experience and that of your students?
Yeah, it's been so awesome, Matthew, to look at my students and what they're doing. Right. So last semester, I had one student who was working for Kevin McCarthy, who's the House Minority Leader, very senior, most Republican in leadership. And then we had a couple more students who were working for very senior members of the United States Senate. And to listen to my students talk with each other about what's going on either end of Capitol Hill, from two prominent leadership spots in the Senate to a couple on the House side. But beyond that, then you start listening to what your students in the agencies have to say, right? People who are working at the Department of Transportation, people who are working at the Department of Commerce. And you get people who are really at the tip of the spear, right? Because the lawmakers write the law that the president signs, but then you have interns who are at the agencies that are actually implementing what the Congress and what the president have sought to do. And I've had, excuse me, students who have actually interned in the embassies. Had a student who interned in the embassy from Mexico. She always brought great food to class too. But it gives it a very interesting flavor to the topics of discussion, because people can say, oh, well, I remember we talked about this in class a few weeks ago, but someone in my office asked me to write a background brief for the Congresswoman. And I remember we covered this in class. So they're able to blend what they're learning in-class instruction with what they're doing with their internships. And I think that that gives us a really robust opportunity for students, both inside and outside of the campus, to continue to learn and to be that sponge at every opportunity. And the best part of it, I would also say, is that they get to interact with students from universities from around the world. So it's not just the NYU experience. Your fellow intern who you might be sitting next to may have gone to Penn. They may have gone to, you name it. And so they also get to meet people from backgrounds and states that they've never seen, heard of, or met before. And that further enriches, I think, their experience as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting that all of our global sites are very intimate environments, and yet when you're there, you're also moving out to meet students from that country, other countries, other universities as well. It's this interesting combination of great intimacy. In Washington, DC, we have a beautiful new building where students live in the building as well as study in the building, right? But then at the same time, that there's this sort of centripetal force to work within the building, there's also a centrifugal force to get out into the larger community, both professionally, as you're saying, and culturally, right? To meet people who are very different from oneself. And it's a distinctive quality of the global sites, I think, don't you?
100%. And I look at this, and one of the things, I have a couple students this semester, and I've had a couple in years past who are interested in television. And they look at me and they're like, well, you're on television. And I said, yeah, last time I checked. And I said, you know what we're going to do? Field trip. We're going to go to the DC bureau of the BBC, and I'm going to bring you in, and all of you, and you're going to watch how we start the show. And I'm going to cram you in the control room, or at least as many as I can get you around the control room. And they get to see how the different presenters get ready to do television, and they get ready to do the thing. Then the show starts, and then you walk them over, and you're like, no cell phone, no noise, and you wait for a break, and then you open the door and you bring everybody in the studio, and they sit on the floor. And then they bring me in, put the chair in, and you get all the get up. And then they get to watch me do a live segment around the world. And you know, the show that I'm on, we're averaging somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 million people. So you have less than 20 students who are watching a live broadcast going out that's being watched by 40 to 50 million people around the world. And then once the show ends, the presenter Caddy K, sat with the students and asked them who they were and where they're from and what their interests were. And those are just the little things that you can do that make a huge difference. Because like for me, I'm just going to work, right? But for your students, they're showing up, and it was the cutest thing. They're all wearing coats and ties and dresses, and they're all ready to go. But it's a nice shot in the arm, and an unexpected one that it's a fun thing for me to be able to do. But it's memories that I mean, my goodness, I still years later hear back from students about things like that.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit just about you and your teaching. Can you say a little bit about the courses that you teach? How you experience our students, what impression you have of our students, because as you know, they're coming from all of our many schools in New York and our other two major campuses, Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. Say a little bit about your relationship and your experience of those students, because it's clear from what you just said that you're teaching for us. You have a lot on your plate. You do a lot of things, but your teaching for us means an awful lot to you.
It's a hallmark of what I do, right? I mean, there's nothing better than, and you know it, and Michael knows it, and you can see it, of watching a light bulb go off over a student's head about a concept that they've been grappling with. And that's why you get into this business, because you love watching that light bulb go off and the inquisitive nature of the student. So let's back this up. So I teach a class called the American Presidency. And a lot of the students coming from abroad have heard of George Washington, or they've heard of James Madison, but they haven't heard that much about many of the other presidents except maybe Abraham Lincoln. And so we start off at the very beginning. And we start off with the conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And in other words, those who wanted to have a strong break with the monarchy in England, and those who wanted to have a little sort of insurance, if you will, that the American presidency wouldn't become a monarch. It wouldn't be another king of England or a king of the United States. And you take that arc from the Constitutional Convention, and you talk about the Federalist Papers, and you talk about what Alexander Hamilton and his folks were trying to do. And then the immediate tensions that you have in the immediate American presidency. The election of 1800, for example, where boom, right out of the gate, you have a constitutional crisis of who should be the duly elected president. And how did what the framers do when writing that constitution, it immediately faced a test and they were able to go past that test. And then you go through American history. And I love with my students is they gain more confidence with the institution of the presidency itself. Then by the time that you hit what I really call the seminal moment in American history, which is the use of American power, which is the turn of the century in the 20th century, where you have the assassination of McKinley, and you suddenly have a very young Theodore Roosevelt who becomes president of the United States. And he views his role of the Constitution, again, that we fought about back in the Constitutional Convention, of I'm going to do everything in the Constitution unless it tells me that I can't do it. And then you look at his successor in office, Taft, and he says, wait a second, I'm not going to do anything in my power unless the Constitution tells me I can do it. And we look at the juxtaposition of American power and the way that they wield that power. And then once you hit that point in the early part of the 20th century, then the students are a bit more familiar with the different presidents, right? Well, what did Kennedy do to get us into the Bay of Pigs in Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis? How did he wield power? Wait a second. President Johnson, and you're talking about the war on poverty, and look at so much of what he did for the Great Society using executive orders that we talked about at the beginning of our session here. And then finally you get to Barack Obama and you get to Donald Trump and now Joe Biden. And I love watching the students come from a rudimentary understanding, perhaps, of the American presidency and our form of democracy to they're writing their final papers on why I think President Trump should issue an executive order dealing with DACA, the undocumented students, and go around Congress without going through. And it's amazing for me to watch this from their evolution from the beginning of the course and then, a dozen weeks or so later of where they wind up. And I love doing it.
Yeah, it's clear that you really do love this. I'm struck when you talk, because you're speaking as a scholar, as a lawyer, but also as a practitioner. Do you think you're teaching this course, and also your colleagues who are also lecturers at the site, so many of them are also practitioners as well as scholars, do you think it matters that you and they wear these two hats, so to speak, that you would teach the course that you're talking about right now, let's say the presidency or the Constitution, somewhat differently if you had these two perspectives?
I do, because I'm teaching a brand new / old course called Private Influence in Public Policy. And we were in class last night for the better part of 3 hours. And we just finished our theoretical discussion, right? Here's what the scholars in American political science were saying in the 1950s, and they were saying in the 1960s about how do you get an agenda setting policy and how do these agenda items make it to public policymakers? And I always say, the best way that you can learn this is you have to go to the theoretical, you have to go to the academicians of their view of political science. And then I can give you my perspective as one who worked on Capitol Hill for nearly 9 years and worked in the White House for 4, of this is what the theorists are telling you. And you have to have that foundation from an academic perspective. But now let's weave in some of my experiences. And so last night, for example, we discussed the eightfold path, and we don't have the time to get into all this, but it talks about the 8 steps that you need to get into to get an idea from its inception, essentially, to being implemented. And I used an example that we had in early 2002 with the Vice President's office of a drought on the California and Oregon border, of a congressperson who heard from their constituents and said there's a drought. And they're Native Indian folks, Native Americans who wanted to use this water. There's the Endangered Species Act that says there are only certain uses that can be utilized for this water. Boom, number 1, define the issue. Okay, let's plug in this real life application. So we went through the different 8 paths, and I walked them through how does this get to the presidential level, and how does the president working with the Congress ultimately come out with a solution? So as a practitioner, I'm able to weave in my experiences from the real world that I've had to deal with. but as a scholar and one who's in the classroom, you still can give them that foundation. So I think that our lecturers here have the dual hat of, yes, we've got the academic chops of getting the best scholarship, but interweaving that with our own personal relationships.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. We think about what's so special about this site, and it is the experiential quality of the education, the internships that students can have, the intimacy of the scale, the very rich co-curriculum that takes place because NYU at all of its centers mounts rich programs of its own, but because we're in DC, we do many more rich ones. But maybe the greatest hallmark is the combination of theory and practice that you were talking about, or the combination of classroom and community that infuses not only your teaching, but virtually all of our classes and all of what goes on at the site. I want to end, we're running short of time, but I have to ask one more, even more personal question, just to talk a little bit about your relationships with your students, because I know that you stay in touch with students well after the time that they've been in your class. And obviously the teaching means so much to you, as you made clear, but it obviously means a lot to your students. Do you want to say a little bit about that, call it a mentoring role or an alumni, an NYU DC alumni role, if you want to talk about that a little bit?
I wish you could see my wall over there. The students every year overwhelm me with their generosity of giving me something. And, you know, so there's a tea set that I got from NYU Abu Dhabi. And there's one with a fireside chat. It's a fireside chat little thing. When we were talking about it, and my entire bookshelf is chock full of those different things that the students have given me. And it's not just the gifts that they give me, but the gift that I get, as you say, for keeping in touch. And, you know, I'll take one student, Hannah Williams, who was a student of mine several years ago, who went over on a Fulbright, and she went to Laos, and she did a phenomenal job over there in a very difficult circumstance. And, you know, you get these emails periodically of, well, the internet's back on, so I just wanted to dash off and let you know what my experience is. And then she comes back to the United States and teaches, and now she's applying to Harvard Law School. And you look at my students, and I have one now, Daniel Park, who was a student of mine from semester past, and now he's back and he's in Korea. And he talks about the world, and I always tease him, and I will start class and I'll say, Daniel, tell me what the world is like tomorrow, so whether or not it's worth it for us to get out of bed to make sure that tomorrow is still okay for us. And it's those little things that you get with your students. I mean, I've been at NYU since 2017, and there's not a week that doesn't go by, not one that doesn't go by that I don't hear from some student about something of either I graduated, I finally got out, I got a job, I'm engaged, you name it. But I wish you could just see that collection of mementos that they may have thought that they spent 10 to 15 bucks just to get me something to say thank you. But I look at that as a wealth of something that I just cherish. I really do.
That's lovely. Ron, thank you. We've been at this now for a good part of 3/4 of an hour. I think maybe we could keep talking indefinitely, obviously, but I think I'm going to pause now, if that's okay with you, Ron, and see if there are any questions from our colleagues who are on the call, and also any students who might be on the call, things that you would like to know or comment on. So we'll pause and see what comes in.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you both so much. And I could listen to you all day. So I didn't want the conversation to stop, but this has been incredibly informative and just so fascinating. I guess one question that comes up that we haven't discussed at all is the pandemic, and what kind of impact you see or may see or have seen in terms of its impact on global and foreign policy, or domestic and foreign policy, if any.
Let me start from the perspective of, it's been very hard for our students. And I think our students here have done an exemplary job of following the protocols and maintaining their distance. It's hard for them to be in an environment where they've got to be 6 feet apart. It's hard for them to be in a class where they can wear a mask. But at the same time, they are looking at this from the perspective of what we talk about in class, because we talk about the pandemic every single session, because you have to. It's the biggest domestic and international policy issue that I can think of that we're confronting. But they also talk about it in terms of their internships, right? And listening to the students talk about being in a pandemic environment, being an intern on Capitol Hill, witnessing what happened after January 6th, and now what's it like to go to work essentially behind a fortress that is the United States Capitol right now, and what are their mentors, what are their members of Congress, the Senate, what issues are they dealing with? And so I find it fascinating to hear from them of what they're confronting, because I clearly live with this in my world, sort of, being in my home studio for the BBC, but many of them are still going to work, and many of them are still in that environment. And I learned from them listening to what they're up to.
Well, excuse me, thank you both. I just put in the chat for the students, if they want to see what kind of internships that we have available in DC, they can click on that website. There's many more than just those that we have access to. But that might give you a flavor of the different bucket areas of things that we talk about earlier in the conversation today. So Matthew, I actually have a question for you. We kind of glossed over it a little bit at the beginning, but you were the really person who had the idea of NYU in DC. So I'm wondering what gave you that first spark of an idea to form a site like this, and how has it evolved since the conception to where we are today?
Well, it's a really interesting question, but I can't take the credit for the idea. It actually happened many years ago in the backyard of one of our university overseers, where I was meeting with a group of alumni, some trustees and others, and we were just talking, and people said, gee, it's odd. We have, the Brookings, we see the sign in front of Brookings, we have Johns Hopkins Graduate Center for International, Study and Affairs. Why isn't New York University, a great urban university located in Washington? And so I came back to New York City and I raised the issue. And at that time, we were evolving as a really premier global university with sites throughout a network, but nobody had thought domestically. No one had thought that Washington, DC would matter. And once we got those conversations started, and I particularly got them started with students, beginning with students in the college, there was a lot of interest because students and faculty realized that, in a sense, New York and DC are the obverse and the reverse of the same coin, right? That it's one thing to have sites around the world, but that DC would be at least one domestic site that made sense for us to have. And of course, a few years later, as you now know, we have LA as well. So the global network is truly global, but it does have two locations for very good reasons in the States. And then once we came up with that idea, Michael, it just took off. We had faculty and students interested in studying in many different fields, as we said earlier, not just politics. And we had benefactors of the university come forward and said, we would love to support this for you. So our building is the Connie Milstein and Family Center. We have the Abramson Auditorium. Classrooms have proud names of our alumni on them, because the community in Washington, we discovered we had more alumni in Washington, DC than we had even known. And they all rallied together. And so it really took off very quickly, as a matter of fact. And it was a different paradigm for the global network, that the global network could have some sites that were actually domestic because they fit into that larger theory. And that, as you know, was off and running. And you were our very first, and still are with us, as director of the center. We're delighted with that.
Thank you. Michael, there's a question from a student, and I'll just read it out loud. Student is interested in applying for the leadership program for fall 21, but is wondering what the format for the internship will be under the pandemic, remote or in person. And maybe, that might give you a chance to speak a little more about student life and other things as well.
Sure. So internships have almost fully been remote in the fall and this spring as well. There are some notable exceptions, but for the most part, they've all been remote. There is a lot of movement starting even this summer for some internships to be in person. And I'm expecting by the fall to be even more of those. There are some students who we have, frankly, right now who don't want to be in an in-person internship for their own safety and health concerns, which is totally legitimate and understandable. But there are others who are really seeking those in-person experiences. So some of it is just if you happen to apply to the right place and happens to have either virtual or in-person or your choice. I expect by the fall, there's going to be many, many more internship placements that are going to be in person. Whether they're going to be, with masks and social distancing and all of that remains to be seen. But we're all feeling pretty encouraged in the US by our vaccination rates. So we'll just have to see. We can't make any promises, but we're already hearing from providers that they are opening up their experiences to in-person experiences for students. I just wanted to briefly mention a few things about student life that might be helpful for students to know as they're contemplating DC or other places. In DC, a lot of our student excursions are in the city. We don't really go to other cities where you might get that at another site. So we don't do overnight or weekend trips to different places like, Baltimore, Chicago, whatever, but we do a lot of programming in the city. Students tend to travel if they are at our site to New York. So it's about a 2.5 hour train ride. It's about a 4-hour bus ride, depending on traffic. But it's pretty inexpensive to do that and pretty easy for students to go back and forth. So even though you're in DC and craving a New York experience, it doesn't mean that you can't have it with friends and people who might be studying in New York City to be able to go back and forth pretty easily. As far as our own campus, we have a really vibrant Hall Congress. So if you're interested in governance and that kind of activity, we have that available to you. We mentioned our public programs. We also have a student public programs groups called DC Dialogues, where students can actually develop, implement, and show a certain public program over a variety of different areas. We also have lots of student groups. So students decide what they're interested in. We've had a women's empowerment group, students of color group, an environmental justice group, you just name it. It really is up to the students to decide what they want to do, and we can give them some programming money around that as well. It's probably good for you to know as well that there are a group of first-year students that are with us for the full year. So whether you come in the fall or the spring, there will be first-year students from New York's Liberal Studies program who are on campus. In addition to Shanghai students, who we love to have at the site, of course, we also get NYU Abu Dhabi students and, of course, New York students, upper class students. So it's a real mixture of students who are at the site. Sometimes we house external students as a group. So we've had students from Duke, from Johns Hopkins, from Colgate. So some of those might be in the mix as well, depending on what time of year you come and how many New York students are on site. We have a free bike share program. So if you're interested in getting around the city, DC is really bike friendly. So as opposed to maybe some other cities that you've been to, there's lots of bike lanes and lots of options for that. And we'll also be bringing back our free gym membership. So all students have access to a gym that's been suspended because of the pandemic, but I'm pretty confident that by the fall that will be back in place again. So those are just a few highlights of student life. As Matthew mentioned, and Ron did as well, really do think of this site as a place for professional development. You're really going to get a lot of career resources, a lot of practical advice about how to get a job, how to get an internship, how to make a difference in the world. And we also see ourselves as an advocacy and activism site. So what you'll discover very quickly in DC is people are here to make a difference. Whether it's a difference you agree with or not is a different question, but for the most part, people are really passionate about whatever their interest area is. And that's true of students at our site too. So we really think that we're helping train advocates and activists for whatever their next step is in life. And so we're really pleased to have students there. And of course, welcome our Shanghai students as well.
Michael, could I just add one thing to what you said? This may seem odd to mention graduate programs in this context, but we also have, Stern has an MBA program, a low residency MBA at the site. And we also have faculty and graduate students of the Graduate Research Initiative coming from many different departments. And that also affects the feel, the academic and intellectual feel of the site, that it has significant graduate programs as well as undergraduate programs, and in sort of unspecified maybe ways affects the tonality, if you will, for undergraduates at the site, who they meet, the type of conversations they have. I just put that on the table as well. I don't know if you would agree that that's also relevant, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. And we try to encourage whenever it's possible for the graduate students to maybe do a research presentation with undergraduates. We're teaching a research class this spring. So there are some collaborative opportunities there. And as well, we're trying to explore deeper ways for the Stern EMBA graduate students who are getting their MBA to hopefully maybe do some mentoring or some partnering with our undergraduate students interested in business studies. And I know there are a lot of you at NYU Shanghai that fill that role. Janet, did you have something to say, it looked like?
Yes, I was just gonna, for a final question as we near the end, sort of forward thinking for Ron to talk about what advice you would have for recent NYU, Shanghai, New York, and Abu Dhabi graduates who want to come to DC and be successful, whether or not they've studied away in DC previously.
It's the advice that I got from my former boss, John Kasich, congressman and former governor from Ohio, who taught me in my earliest days, never let others tell you what you can't do, right? So, well, you might be coming from this campus, or it might be hard to do this, it might be hard to get a visa. No, don't let anybody tell you what you can't do. You figure out what it is that you want to do. If you want to come to this city, or if you want to come to the United States because that is a passion for yours or an interest to yours, you find a way to make it happen. I've had probably half a dozen of my Abu Dhabi students, for example, come following graduation, and they find themselves here in the States. Same thing with NYU Shanghai. Why? Because they got a taste of this, they got a sense of what's kind of going on around here, and there's a vibe, and they loved it. But I always told them, you can look at adversity as being a hindrance and being a roadblock, or you can look at adversity as being something that you find a way to problem solve to overcome. And that's the best advice I would give them. Don't let anybody tell you what you can't do.
And on that wonderful note, we're going to bring this conversation in, and thank you all so much. This has been just a phenomenal hour, and for those of you in Washington, I really appreciate waking up so early and doing it at this time as well. And so what we'll do is we'll run the slideshow for the remaining few minutes, and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to the Office of Global Programs, and thank you all.